from Leon Panetta, the former Defense Secretary, the former CIA Director, former White House Chief of Staff. Director, always good having you. Did the president adequately explain his position?
Well, I think all of us share moral outrage about Putin and the brutality that he's shown towards Ukrainian people. That's understandable. But this is a moment in time when we just have to be unified between the United States and our allies, show strong unity, and not raise anything that might confuse that relationship. And so I think in the end, it's a comment that probably should not have been used. And I hope it's important that the president exercise as much discipline as possible to make sure that whatever he says is in line with the unity that he's put together between the United States and our allies.
Isn't he also saying, though, what other leaders are saying, Secretary, that, no matter how this war ends, and hopefully soon, and hopefully without much more bloodshed, sanctions and punishments should remain in effect as long as Vladimir Putin is running Russia? Aren't they both on the same page?
Well, I think right now the principal focus would be on the ability to see whether or not we could negotiate some kind of ceasefire and settlement to this conflict in the Ukraine. I'm glad that the Ukrainians and the Russians are going to be meeting with delegations in Turkey. I think that's a positive sign. I think that President Zelensky has indicated that he's willing to accept some kind of neutrality in Ukraine, and that could be very helpful to trying to resolve some of these issues that are there. I think the most important thing is to focus on whether or not there are areas that can be resolved that can get us a ceasefire and that can end this war that's going on in Ukraine.
We don't know if we're going to get that, tomorrow when talks resume in Turkey, to your point, Secretary. But as a former defense secretary, would you pause if working for another president, he or she wanted to engage Vladimir Putin long after all of this, assuming he is still in charge of Russia? Or would you recommend, no, I think we wait it out. He's just an evil guy. He is a monster, and we don't want to be at the same table with him ever.
Now, look, I think no matter how this is negotiated, no matter how it ultimately is resolved, Putin is going to be weakened as a leader, and so is Russia. And
but
I
he
think
would still be a leader, right, Leon? He would still be a leader. So do you have to talk to the guy? Do you ignore the guy? What do you do?
Well, I think the bottom line is that the Russians will determine who their leader is going to be. And it's up to the Russians.
But what if they decide they're fine with him being the leader still, no matter how Ukraine turns out?
I think the Russians are going to face a very difficult position because I think Putin is, without question, seriously weakened as a result of this terrible strategic decision that he made to invade Ukraine. It was a mistake, and I think ultimately he's going to pay the price for that.
Do you think that the president's comments, Secretary, will speed up this effort to overthrow him in Russia, or take away his powers, or even kill him?
No, I think that that the Russians and the Russian people will ultimately make that decision. I think that, considering that Putin is virtually a dictator in Russia, and that the Russians have kind of tolerated his leadership for a long time, it's going to take a real effort within Russia to be able to ultimately see if he's going to be replaced. I think it's I don't think it's a fait accompli that somehow Putin is automatically going to get kicked out of office by the Russian people.
Do you think that we are better off with Putin gone, regardless, down the road? There's another expression, as you're well aware, the devil you know is better than the devil you don't. He could be replaced by someone who is much more dangerous. What do you think?
Well, that's always the case when you go after a bad leader. It was the case when we were going after bin Laden, that even though we would be successful, they would always try to get somebody to replace him. I understand that. But the fact is, if you can get rid of one bad leader, I think the chances are pretty good that the next leader you might very well have a better relationship with in terms of trying to work out the issues that we have with Russia. Look, we're living in the 21st century. This is a global world. I hope that ultimately, in a global world, we can find a way to have a relationship with Russia that involves peace and prosperity.
Very quickly, Secretary, as well, these peace negotiations pick up tomorrow, as you know, and one of the things that we're told the Russians are keen on is keeping the land they've already locked down or quasi-locked down in the eastern part of the country, parts of the south, and that might be a negotiating chit. By that, I mean they would want to keep that to secure an agreement and walk away. Do you think Ukraine would accept that?
I doubt it. I think President Zelensky is not particularly interested in rewarding the Russians for the invasion that they made on Ukraine and allowing them to have territory that they conquered by military force. But having said that, I think that there are a combination of issues, one being the neutrality that President Zelensky said he would support. I think that's an important point that certainly meets the concern of Russia about NATO, future NATO relationship. Number two, with regards to these areas that are under Russian control right now, I think the people there ought to have a right to a referendum to decide whether they want to go with Russia or with Ukraine. I think that could be a potential way to try to resolve those issues. Number three, it's very clear that the Russians have to remove their troops from Ukraine in order to be able to arrive at any kind of meaningful ceasefire. So there are a lot of key elements here that I think could be worked out, assuming that both sides want to try to resolve this terrible war we're in.
So very quickly then, given the President Biden's comments about Vladimir Putin, and that he wasn't really dialing them back, do you think that has emboldened Vladimir Putin to do pretty much whatever the hell he wants because he figures he has nothing to lose?
You know, my experience with Putin is he's a bully, but he's also not stupid. And I think, he's somebody who's been well criticized by the world community, particularly after what he did in Ukraine. But I suspect that his primary worry right now is whether or not he's going to be able to wrap up this terrible war in Ukraine with at least some declaration that it represented accomplishment of some of the missions he was after. That's going to be what Putin is going to have to focus on in order to be able to get the hell out of there.
Leon Panetta, thank you very much. Very good catching up with you.
Good to be with you.